Coming up next, keynote speaker Dr. Benjamin Barber. The following is a production of ReNewableNow.biz and GrowSmart Rhode Island, and is made possible by Bank of America, GZA, Geo-Environmental Incorporated, National Grid, and the Arpin Group.
As a member of both boards, I'm very honored to introduce our keynote speaker. We are formed a partnership to co-present Mr. Barber this morning, and I'm delighted to introduce him to you. He has an awesome resume. He is a senior research scholar at the Center on Philanthropy and Civil Society of the Graduate Center, City University of New York. And he is the Walt Whitman Professor of Political Science Emeritus. Can you all hear me? Yes? At Rutgers University. As an internationally renowned political theorist, he brings an abiding concern for democracy and civilization to issues of politics, globalization, culture, and education in America as well as abroad. He consults regularly with political and civic leaders in the United States and throughout the world. Dr. Barber's 17 books, not 2, 4, 6, 8, but 17 books, include the classic Strong Democracy, published in 1984, the international bestseller Jihad versus McWorld, published in 1995 and translated in 30 languages. His current book, and the one that is of special interest to us today, is entitled If Mayors Ruled the World, and that was published just last fall by Yale University Press. Dr. Barber blogs regularly for the Huffington Post. He writes for The Nation, Harper's Magazine, The New York Times, The Washington Post, The Atlantic Monthly, The American Prospect, Le Nouvel Observateur, as well as The Guardian and several others. He was a founding editor, and for 10 years, he was the editor-in-chief of the distinguished international quarterly Political Theory. He holds a certificate from the London School of Economics and an MA and a doctorate from Harvard University. Dr. Barber appears, often on television, including CNN, Fox News, Bill Moyer's Journal, Charlie Rose. With Patrick Watson, he wrote the prize-winning 10-part PBS BBC series, The Struggle for Democracy. He wrote and narrated the film Music In, featured at the Tribeca and Munich film festivals. His plays have been produced off-Broadway and at regional theaters, while his song lyrics for British tenor Martin Best appear on the album Night on the Road. He wrote the libretto for George Quincy's opera Home and the River, which was produced by Encompass in New York. And finally, I had a chance to chat with Dr. Barber last night, and I'm very excited to report that he is contemplating his next book, which will be titled, If Women Ruled the World. On that note, I present Dr. Barber.
Good morning, Providence. It's a pleasure to be here. People kept asking me yesterday when I arrived, have you ever been in Providence before? And I thought that must also suggest something about people's attitudes here, because of course I've been in Providence before many, many times, lecturing at Brown University, at Providence College, seeing colleagues at the Rhode Island School of Design, meeting my goddaughter here, who has lived here on and off for many, many years, and who is here this morning also. So I know this town well, as so many people do, because Providence is one of the great cities. Let me just say to the tech people, we've got 2 mics going. Is it echoing out there? Because it's echoing up here. It's okay? Okay. I'll have to deal with hearing myself. Providence is a city that has a very old history, you know it. I'm not here as a booster. You've got plenty of those here on the committee. But I am here to talk to you about both Providence, but also about cities. Because when I hear that people here, as in some other cities in America that have experienced the economic turndown, who are dealing with unemployment, who are trying to catch up to the changing demography of the United States, the changing demographics in which so many of our citizens and residents now come from other parts of the world, or come from backgrounds which aren't the classic white American rural Protestant background, which actually Rhode Island once upon a time helped pioneer, because once upon a time this was in a sense the center of white Puritan Protestant America, and a very wonderful center as well. But the world has changed, Providence has changed, and cities have changed. And I want to do 2 things with you this morning. I want to talk first of all by backing up away from Providence. Forget Providence, and let's just think for a minute about the city and where the city is, not just in Rhode Island, the United States, but also in the world, and then bring that back and talk a little bit at the end of my remarks about Providence and what the rebirth, the renaissance of cities around the world can mean and should mean for Providence. Because I sometimes think in cities like Providence and maybe in Cleveland and Pittsburgh and some of our older cities that are thought of as part of the Rust Belt, the part of the United States of America that has lost the game because of the movement away of manufacturing to other continents, that people really are not aware of what has happened to cities in the last 20 or 30 years, and particularly in the last 10 years. So I want to start by saying something about the city renaissance globally, and why Providence not just should be, but in fact, whether you know it or not, already is at the very front of that renaissance and has a vital role to play, not just in this region, in New England, but throughout the United States and the world. And indeed, I will end with an invitation for Providence to take part in a new project for a global mayor's parliament that is being developed in several continents right now. But let me start with a story, because one of the reasons, so people always tell me one of the problems here in Providence is that when you get a good mayor here in Pawtucket or in some of the other cities around the state, they very quickly move on. And moving on in America tends to be moving up, which is to say we are a country, as so many are, obsessed with national power, state power, national power. You've seen it recently. Cory Booker, successful mayor of Newark, moving on to the Senate there. John Hickenlooper, very successful transpartisan mayor of Denver, moving on to be governor of Colorado. Gavin Newsom, terrific mayor of San Francisco, now kind of invisible as the lieutenant governor of California. We tend to think, move up, move up. The important work is being done at the state and the national level. Well, as the subtitle of my book suggests, that simply is not true anymore. My book is called If Mayors Ruled the World: Dysfunctional Nations, Rising Cities, and I don't think I need to make too big a case for dysfunctional nations. You can look down south and see a federal government of the United States that in the last couple of years literally closed its doors twice. Closed its doors. The most powerful government in the United States simply stopped doing business for a while. And aside from the fact that a lot of America didn't even notice, what was terrible about that was the sense that our national government is paralyzed. I don't want to get into a discussion here. You can imagine and you know why it's happening. It happens to do with the polarization of our politics, with the inability of the parties to talk to one another, with the sense some Americans have that government is the problem and not the solution, and therefore the main thing people elected to office should do is close it down. That's a disastrous way of thinking, and it has infected our national politics. So the dysfunction of states is very real, and it's not just here. If you read about Berlusconi in Italy, if you read about David Cameron's inability to bring his Conservative Party into a point of real leadership in England, if you look at what's happening in many countries around the world, you will see that national governments are no longer succeeding. But I want to suggest that there's a deeper cause. It's not just about polarization. It's not just about some of the current features of our national politics here. It is about a fundamental change in the modern world. The nation state was invented 400 or 500 years ago as a response to the growing territory and populations in Europe and elsewhere that meant the old city-state, the principality, the New England township that was so useful in the 16th and 17th century could no longer cope with the problems of large territories. And the new peoples, the French people, the English people, the German and Italian people who were emerging out of the smaller tribal groups of the Middle Ages. And the nation state was born as an attempt to create a popular and legitimate sovereign form of jurisdiction that could encompass vast new territories, as James Madison said here, a republic of continental extent. And it was an extraordinary solution because it did, through representation and federalism, allow democracy, which had been born in the ancient city, to survive into a period of large-scale peoples and territories. And for the last 300 or 400 years, the nation state has been the fundamental and primary political institution. And to this day, when we talk about politics, though we may gossip about what happens in Pawtucket or in Providence or in Quincy, we're actually talking about what goes on in Washington. We watch television, we watch national politics. That's true in France, that's true in China, that's true in Indonesia, that's true around the world. Politics is what happens nationally. But something changed since World War II. Really, at the beginning of the last century, it started to change, and now the change is complete. The world of separate territories and peoples defined by invented nations, the American people, the Mexican people, the Japanese people, the Indonesian people, has given way to a new, rather scary, interdependent, globalized world in which national borders no longer define or limit the problems we face. And that has given rise to a dilemma that the nation state has proved incapable of coping with. And it's the dilemma of an asymmetrical world in which every problem we face in the 21st century is global and interdependent, and we are still responding to those problems with nation-state, parochial, sovereign, territorial, bounded nations which are incapable of cooperating across borders to deal with our cross-border problems. There is no realm in which this is not true. Just think for a minute about the major problems we face. I know people complain about the humid weather here in the summer, but as far as I know, there's no Rhode Island warming, or New England warming, or American warming. We face the problem of global warming, and as the global environment changes, there is no nation that by itself, even were it to be far more virtuous than we are, could deal with that problem. When I was growing up, a little bit south of here in Manhattan, my mom used to say to me, don't go to New Jersey today, dear. There's a virus over there. You might get the New Jersey virus. My children and grandchildren don't worry about the New Jersey virus. They worry about Hong Kong flu, West Nile virus, Mexican pig flu, HIV, the new diseases coming out of the pandemics that issue from the hot zones of Africa. Disease, crime, drugs are global problems, not territorial problems. And of course, the economy, I needn't tell anybody in Providence, Rhode Island, what has happened to the economy. It's not just that the old textile industries and the old paper mills that made this part of the world so productive and wealthy 100 years ago have moved on. It's that the economy itself has moved on to a global market economy in which no state, no city, no nation can any longer control the economy within it. There are no more American firms of the big corporations. The MNC, the multinational corporation, is a reality. Chevrolet, that great American auto firm, makes most of its cars in places like Mexico with 60 or 70% imported parts. BMW makes a lot of its cars now in South Carolina from more than half American parts. So which is the American and which is the German company? You can no longer distinguish. We know that firms today move not just out of Providence or Rhode Island or New England. They move out of the United States. They go where the labor is cheap, where the markets are nearby, where you can manufacture things more cheaply. We know that even a great firm like Apple took its glass manufacturing to China and in effect used something like bondage labor to make its glass because it really wasn't very concerned with social justice or its American patriotism or all the great things that they write about when they write about Apple. It was interested in cheap labor and getting things done, and that's the way the global economy works. That's simply a fact. I sometimes think people in Rhode Island don't have enough of a sense that the problems here economically of the loss of manufacturing, the loss of the traditional economic jobs, is not a Providence problem or a Rhode Island problem or even an American problem. It is a global problem. I've spent a lot of time this winter in Europe, and Europe is regretting the same thing, the loss there of their traditional industries and so on to places like India and China. Of course, you know, you just read the elections in India. India rues the fact that it is losing manufacturing. It is losing new knowledge economy jobs to places like Indonesia and new economies in Nigeria and elsewhere. It's a global economy, folks. It's a global economy, and that's a fact. And to sit, thinking about, gosh, what's wrong with Providence? Why couldn't we keep the textile plants here? Why isn't jewelry still as big as it used to be? Is simply to misunderstand the world we live in and to worry about things that have nothing to do with the qualities and capacities and virtues of this city, but have to do with the changing global economy. So the economic market is global. Crime is global. Terrorism and war are global in ways we couldn't understand. After 9/11, you know what George Bush did? He went looking like a 19th century president for the enemy in a capital country that must have been responsible for invading the United States. And we went to war in Iraq and then in Afghanistan. But it turned out Al-Qaeda is actually a malevolent non-governmental organization. It belongs to no particular state. It knows no loyalty. Al-Qaeda understands interdependence and a non-bordered world much better than we do. And warfare today, as a result, is asymmetrical. We are the most powerful country in the world militarily. We spend far more than any other nation. We have 10 carrier groups in our Navy. We have an extraordinary Air Force, great infantry divisions and Marine divisions. But they are of no use at all in the new forms of terrorism and warfare. We weren't invaded on 9/11. People who had been here for years stole American airplanes, turned them into weapons, and devastated our country. We weren't invaded by an army. Today, a suicide bomber can do things that no B-1 bomber can stop them from doing. The suicide bomber is our greatest threat in a way, and if you look at the morning papers, you'll see again bombs going off, roadside bombs, suicide bombs all over the world. That's the new warfare. And we never know quite who's responsible and who's doing it. So again, a state, an old nation state, organized around the kind of warfare from the last century and the 19th century, where nations collided and made war through armies and invaded one another and pushed one another back. That world has vanished, but we still tend to live in it and think that's what it's about. So whether you talk about the economy or climate or crime or technology or disease, we are talking about an interdependent world whose problems are global in scope, to which we still respond with limited, territorial, bounded, sovereign, independent nation states. And then we wonder, why don't we get much done? Why in global warming, since the beginning of the process, the UN introduced the COPS process 20, 25 years ago, there's been zero progress towards a better Kyoto Protocol. Why we're approaching the meetings in Paris next year with the hope that maybe finally something will be done in an area where, in fact, warming has continued, sea rise has begun, we see the melting of the glaciers, and yet states say, sorry, nothing we can do. That is the dilemma of the 21st century. And that's the dilemma that has led to a renaissance of cities. Because what we see is that the only way we are going to deal with this problem is to find new kinds of political institutions that can deal globally and locally with problems states are no longer in a position to deal with. And that's why in this book I make a simple suggestion. It's time in political science, in politics, to change the subject. From presidents and prime ministers to mayors. From states and regional bodies back to cities. From the passive spectator citizens of national politics, where being interested in politics means you watch television, to the engaged citizenship of neighborhoods and towns and cities where people still feel they can make a difference and where engagement can still pay off, and where groups like the ones that are sponsoring this meeting today can make a real difference, where citizens are still genuinely engaged, where trust levels are still high. I mean, one of the extraordinary things, and by the way, this is mirrored around the world, it's not just America, but here in America we know that the presidency right now has a 38 or 40% trust level. The Supreme Court, which used to be above politics, now has below 50% trust levels. The Congress of the United States, excuse me, Congressman, but you know the facts. We elect a Congress directly here in America where only 1 of 10 trust that Congress. I mean, the trust levels in the Congress, 8, 9, 10%. 1 of 10 Americans only trust the organization they choose, that they call for. I mean, that's extraordinary. But the one place where trust levels are still 60, 70, even 75% is with local officials, with mayors, with city councilors, with district leaders. Why? Because they're our neighbors, because they're about us, because they come from our communities, because we still have some hope for democracy. One of the most chilling and, to me, frightening parts of living in this 21st century is how in the old democracies so many people have lost faith in democracy, particularly young people who don't vote, particularly people of color, minorities who most need the vote, who, for the most part, push it aside and just think it doesn't matter, it doesn't count. So many young people now who see public service as a corrupt and poor choice for a career and instead go into banking and accounting and lawyers, and they go into the private market. Not because they're greedy, not because greed is good, but because for them public service is bad, because it looks like nothing can be done there. That lack of faith, loss of faith in democratic institutions is a terribly dangerous thing in this old and great democracy, but you see it in the new democracies, the emerging democracies. Take the Arab Spring. Just a couple of years ago, so much hope for change and self-government in parts of the world that didn't have it. And today, the Arab Spring has gone straight to winter with no summer. Egypt, Syria, Libya, places where people hoped a revolution would bring democracy, have not done so, because there again, the illusion that overthrowing a dictator creates a democracy. You don't create democracy by overthrowing tyranny. The creation of democracy is slow, hard work of the kind the people of New England 200 or 300 years ago labored to make possible. So democracy too is in trouble, not just the nation state, in this new interdependent world. And if I said to you, in an interdependent world of interdependent problems, where are the democratic interdependent institutions that are responding? You look around and say, well, I suppose the UN, but the UN is made up of nation states, and the same sovereignty there in the Security Council and the veto and the squabbling General Assembly make the UN a poor candidate to actually respond effectively to global problems, despite the goodwill of the Secretary General. The Bretton Woods institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, a lot of good people working there and doing some good things, but again, nation state based, and so subject to all the quarrels of nation states. In effect, the old sovereign-based institutions don't work, and we don't have, at the global level, new institutions. And that's where the city has emerged as a new and vital player. The oldest of our political institutions has now become the newest and most important contributors to solving real problems. And that's happening at two levels. It's happening, first of all, at the local level. It's happening because cities are very good at problem solving. That's what they do. And that's why mayors tend to be a different kind of person than governors or presidents or congressmen, because to be a mayor is by necessity to be a problem solver. And to be a problem solver means you can't be too partisan. It means you can't be too ideological. It means you can't stand on principle while your city goes down the drain. You have to do what's necessary to make a city work. There's a great story by Teddy Kollek, the mayor of Jerusalem in the 1980s, and he was a Zionist and not very open to Islam and other Christianity, but nonetheless, as the mayor, he had to deal with the reality that he lived in a multicultural, multi-ethnic, multi-religious city, and he was often plagued by groups of rabbis and imams and Christian prelates coming to his office and arguing about access to the holy site and giving him sermons about why their historical claim to the holy sites was better than the others. And one day, he's reputed to have said, "Gentlemen, gentlemen, please spare me your sermons, and I will fix your sewers." That's what mayors do. They fix the sewers. Mr. de Blasio, Bill de Blasio, came to New York with a wonderful progressive agenda, but he took his eye off the ball a little bit initially because of the agenda. We had 6 bad snowstorms, as you did too, this winter. And he learned right away that if he didn't get the snow plowed, just as John Lindsay learned the same thing 40 years ago, his progressive agenda was gone straight down the drain, because you have to do that. He also learned that to get a progressive agenda through, you need coalition building. You need consensus politics. Presidents give orders. Mayors build coalitions. They work on a tripod of civic institutions, private business, and the public sector. And unless they bring all three together, they're not going to solve the problems. And the things you've done here in Providence, you've done when mayors work together with the business sector, with the market sector, with civil society, with Brown and Rhode Island School of Design and the hospitals, and with public officials. That's the only way you can get things done in cities, because you don't have that mandatory, imperative power top down. Cities work bottom up. You've got to get citizens involved. You've got to get civil society involved. And that's what mayors do. And by the way, they do that whether they start out partisan or not. I know you've got a very blue state here, but I was in Kansas recently at the a similar meeting actually of the Municipal Society there. And believe it or not, Red Kansas has about 52% of its population living in towns and cities, over 10, 15,000. And in those towns and cities whose 300 mayors or so and city managers I addressed, I learned to my amazement that about half of them did not identify with any party, though they were probably from just, Kansas, the other side of Rhode Island, mostly Republican, very few Democrats. But it didn't really matter at the city level because they didn't talk about Democrat, Republican. They talked about how they can get the work done they need to do, and that's true of mayors all over the place. Boris Johnson, the very successful mayor of London, is a Tory, but he calls himself an anarcho-Tory because he's somewhat of a liberal on a lot of social issues and so forth. The new mayor of Bristol, England, George Ferguson, was elected the first time it's happened as somebody who refused to announce as a liberal, as a Tory, or a socialist. He ran as an independent and won that way. We know that Mike Bloomberg in New York started out as a Democrat, then he was a Republican, and finally said, "That's irrelevant, I'm an independent." And he said that the party label isn't important. Party politics and ideology aren't important. My job is to solve problems pragmatically. And the result is city mayors are in a position where they don't get caught in the ideological trap of posturing and standing on principle. And the result is that cities don't and can't close down. We've closed the government of the United States. Try closing Providence. Try closing Worcester. Try closing New York. You can't close a city. They weren't closed in the Middle Ages during plague and siege, and you can't close them today. What? No fire department? No hospitals? no sewers, no schools, no public jobs. You close down a city and you destroy it. You close down the United States and a few people blink and we move on. I mean, that is the difference. That's an exaggeration, but there's a fundamental difference. And that's because cities are not just another level of government. And here I want to transition to talk a little more about Providence itself, because I was in Europe at the European Commission a couple months ago talking to the Commissioner for the Regions and Cities, and he said, as the people of Brussels often do, imitating Washington speak in its European version, he said, oh yes, we're going to give more money back to cities because cities are a very important level of governance nowadays, he said. And I said, Mr. Commissioner, actually cities are not another level of governance. Cities are the fundamental human community. Cities are what define us as civic beings. Cities gave birth to the term citizenship. City, citizenship, they're born together. Cities are where we are born, where we grow up, we're educated, we go to school, we get our jobs, we get married, have children, we play and we pray, we do all those important things, and eventually we get old and we die. And when people talk about cities, they are talking about the human identity, the fundamental human community. And that's very different than talking about an abstract bureaucracy of a state capital or a national capital. Because cities really are about us, and they say who we are, which is, I know, why people in a city like Providence, when they're not quite sure about their future, really worry about it. Because you're not just worried about the city bureaucracy and the public library or something like that. You're thinking about your fundamental community and the community of your children and the community where your children and grandchildren will grow up. You're thinking about the future. Cities are about our past and future. They hold us together. So what happens in the city, the governance of the city, is of more than academic or political science concern. It goes to the heart of who we are. And that's why cities around the world have become today so important. That's why cities are solving problems that nation states aren't. Just to take the example of climate change, one of our most urgent problems, and I mentioned that the UN process has gotten nowhere over 25 years. Over the last 10 or 15 years, cities have formed groups like the C40 climate cities, like a group called ICLE, the International Environmental Issues Organization, like Energy Cities Europe. These are networks of cities that are working on climate change, setting standards, sharing best practices. We've seen how bike share programs and pedestrian zones and congestion fees have been used worldwide to begin to deal with the issues of climate change in the city. And well, they should. Cities create 80% of the world's wealth and about 80% of its carbon emissions, which means they have both the resources, if the state leaves them those resources, doesn't tax them all away, and they have the capacity to make a genuine impact on climate change. One good example for you is Los Angeles under Mayor Villaraigosa. Mayor Villaraigosa found that the horrendous pollution and much of the carbon emissions of Los Angeles came from not the freeways, which is what I would have thought, but from the port. Los Angeles is the largest port in the United States. Something like 40–50% of all our goods come into Long Beach and into Los Angeles. And he figured if he could green up the port, he could have a powerful impact. And he asked Obama for help, and Obama said, sorry, I can't get anything done in Washington. I can't help you. You're on your own here. So instead, he talked to people in Shanghai, in Rotterdam, and in other ports, and developed a strategy. Get all those idling container ships and tankers, when they sit at port with their idling diesel engines spewing carbon emissions into the atmosphere, get them to do what the small sailboats do, plug in. Turn off their engines and plug in while they unload and offload. And get the 12,000 trucks that come in and out of the Port of Los Angeles every day, upgrade their engines, give them hybrid engines. He did those two things and a couple of other measures over the 5 or 6 years, and he did it locally. He didn't do it with any federal help. And over that period, he cut port emissions in half. And because they were 40% of carbon emissions, that means he eliminated 1/5, 20% of Los Angeles carbon emissions. Down in New York, Mayor Bloomberg did it a different way. The problem in New York is the oldest housing stock and business building stock in the United States, and boy, they leak. They leak air conditioning in the summer, they leak heat in the winter. So he introduced new retrofitting standards for insulation for the old buildings. He painted the roofs white all through Brooklyn and the Bronx. When you fly over, have a look. They're all white so they reflect the light in the summer, don't absorb heat. And he created new standards for new buildings. And the result was something like an 11% energy saving in New York, and the savings from the carbon that would have come from the use of that energy, just by insulation. In Latin America, they do it through rapid transit systems that for 5% of the cost of a subway gives you a surface subway system in effect. And that allows you to save extraordinary energy. So around the world, cities are making a difference. What about Providence? Are you standing there, sir? You sort of warned me that I should be drawing things to a close. I sort of thought that's what he was doing, but I'm sure you won't want me to stop before saying a few words about Providence. I could stop now, but let me just take this back to Providence. But the reason I wanted to talk a little bit about the world is that I want you to know that the issues here, it's a little, there's a joke about the little old lady who was asked about the Great Depression in the 1930s, and she said, well, it wouldn't be so bad if it hadn't come along in such bad times, she said. And that's sometimes, Providence doesn't realize it's the bad times globally for nation states and for manufacturing that's causing a lot of the problems here. But here is the reality about Providence itself. This is, you know it, I don't have to be a booster, you know its history, you know what it's done. But I think what happens in cities sometimes is we focus a lot on what's gone by, what we've lost. And I know you think, well, we've lost our manufacturing base, we've lost that great textile industry we used to have, we've lost some of the old great leadership families here, the old Protestant families that for so long provided kind of leadership. It makes it very hard here. People keep saying to me, where are the new leaders? Where is that going to come from? People talk a lot about what they've lost. I have heard so much talk about Studio 38 since I have been here. But then I say, oh, so this is some brand new problem that's come up in the last couple of months? Oh no, this is years old. This is a very old problem. And then I ask myself, well, so why don't you pay off the bad debt and move on? Because it's time to put that behind you. It's time to stop thinking about what Rhode Island and what Providence has lost and start thinking about what you have. Because what you have and what every city has in this new age where cities are so important is absolutely extraordinary. I mean, you have, first of all, a growing population that more and more looks like the population of America. I think roughly half of Providence are people from different backgrounds, not the old white America that we know so well. So increasingly, Providence looks like America, and that's good for Providence because Providence looks like America, and America looks like the world. And people say here, oh, we can't get anything done, but then they tell me, yeah, well, we did move an interstate highway, and we moved a river, and a few other small things, but we really can't get anything done here. We don't have the right leadership. And if you look at what you do have, the institutional base in civil society, you may have a weaker manufacturing section than you used to, that's for sure, but you have one of the strongest institutional civil society sectors in the United States of America, with great world reputation universities and schools and hospitals. And you have entrepreneurial folks working here and people working in industries who they probably shouldn't be working here. I talked to Jason Kelly last night more on industries, and obviously they could probably do better, or maybe they thought they could do better in a place like Houston, but they've stayed here because they think this is a city where they want to be. So there are extraordinary resources, and if you start measuring who you are by what you have and not by what you've lost, you will find that you have extraordinary potential. Moreover, the other plea I get tired of from cities is, yeah, but where are the leaders? We're a great city, but we don't have the right leaders. We need better leaders. There is a simple fact about democracy that every democratic theorist will tell you. Democracy and the quality of democracy is measured by its citizenry, not by its leaders. Democracy is as good as its citizens, and not better. And we get the leaders we deserve because it's the citizens who choose the leaders, who promote the leadership, and so forth. And the real issue here in Providence is not about leadership. But it's about you, it's about us, it's about the citizenry. And if the people in this room want the kind of Providence I know they do, then there is nothing between you and the future in getting it, because you will be able to do it. People around this room have said to me, a number of the people last night at dinner have said, well, we're waiting for the right leaders to come. But there's a great old gospel song. Obama quoted it during his campaign. I love the phrase, we are the ones we've been waiting for. And you're the ones, in a sense, you're waiting for. You're the ones you're looking for. The leadership I talked to, I won't name them, it might embarrass them, but I talked to some extraordinary civic and private business people in the city, and I said, gee, why aren't you running for mayor? And I bet there are 100 people in this room who maybe could ask themselves that question. Why aren't you running for city council? Why aren't you running for mayor here in Pawtucket or around the state? Why aren't you taking that responsibility? Because the citizenry is strong, and if the leadership is weak, that means the citizenry has to take an even greater role. Cities are participatory, cities are democratic, cities are the future of the world. Cities, when they work together, can solve problems together, and Providence can be part of what has become a global urban revolution. And I want to end by inviting you and the public officials here to think about joining with me and 50 or 75 other mayors who will be meeting in Amsterdam in September to talk about the convening of a global parliament of mayors, where mayors can begin to do together the things that they haven't been able to do just one by one, because cities together are even stronger than cities alone. So I believe Providence can be part of an urban revolution and a global governance revolution, and I believe you're in a position to make the difference. Thank you for bringing me here this morning to share these ideas with you, but it's not about me, I think you know. It's very much about you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. It's terrific. Thank you.
This has been a ReNewableNow.biz and GrowSmart Rhode Island production.